Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council gets into a huddle in a bid to put the economy on the high growth path again. After holding its first meeting, the council identifies 10 key areas for concerted action. The head of the panel, Bibek Debroy, however, cautions against giving fiscal goals a miss to pump prime the economy. The council, meanwhile, will interestingly also recommend on monetary policy. There are no signs of an economic slowdown in India, and global investors are as upbeat as ever. That's the assertion coming in from none other than Finance Minister Arun Jaitley in an exclusive conversation with ET Now. Jaitley says, despite some deliberate attempts to talk down the economy, India remains one of the top FDI destinations. BJP patriarch Yashwant Sinha sharpens his attack against the party's top leadership, this time over the way they handled the alleged graft charges against Amit Shah's son Jai Shah. Says the BJP has lost its moral high ground due to the controversy. Singles out Railways Minister Piyush Goyal for acting like Jai Shah's chartered accountant. In a landmark verdict, India's top court rules that sex with a minor wife against her consent is rape, stopping short of ruling out the contentious issue of marital rape. The country's top court reads down the exception that allows a man to have sex with his wife above the age of 15. 2 weeks after the deadly stampede in Mumbai's stampede at Elphinstone that killed 23 people, the Western Railways pins the blame on rains and rumours. An internal probe panel absolves the railways officials, even as it overlooks key issues of poor infrastructure and the negligence on part of the railway staff. Gajendra Chauhan turns the villain as veteran actor and BJP sympathizer Anupam Kher checks into the Film and Television Institute of India as its new chairman. The students of the Premier Film Institute, who had launched a 140-day protest against Chauhan, launched a fresh tirade against the government, calling Kher's appointment a joke, politically motivated. Ola shores up the ammo to take on arch-rival Uber, raises $1.1 billion in fresh funding from China's Tencent Holdings and existing investor SoftBank. The homegrown cab aggregator, which is the driver's seat in the domestic market, confirms that it is in advanced talks to raise another $1 billion. Madrid takes the first step towards suspending Catalan autonomy. Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy asks the Catalonian government to clarify whether or not it has declared independence, even as millions of Barca fans keep their fingers crossed. At stake is La Liga's legacy. Good evening. The wise men and women who have been entrusted to advise the Prime Minister on the Indian economy met for the first time today. Under the chairmanship of Bibek Debroy, the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister will look into 10 specific areas, including fiscal framework, monetary policy, jobs, economic growth and consumption, to name just a few. On its first day, the Council advised fiscal consolidation, but doesn't India really need a stimulus like never before? Also, with their recommendations on monetary policy that they intend to do leads to direct confrontation with the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee. Does the Council believe there is a slowdown? And what are the factors that have led to softening of growth? Prime Minister Modi's economic push is on the radar as far as the India development debate this evening is concerned. I am Supriya Srinath. Joining us right here on the India Development Debate, a very, very special guest, Dr. Rathin Roy, Director at NIPFP, and of course a very prominent member of that council. Can't thank you enough for being with us this evening on the show, sir. But I do want to talk to you about some things that was said right after the PMEAC, the Economic Advisory Council did do that briefing. You seem to indicate that there is a consensus, at least within the panel, on factors that have led to the slowdown. What is your view on the slowdown? Because many will say that the Prime Minister did set aside slowdown fears. He set aside slowdown concerns.
No, I think if that was the impression you got, I must correct it. This is the trouble when you're doorstepped. I did not say there was a consensus on the factors that led to the slowdown, simply because that is not the discussion that was not part of the discussion. The discussion really was on the stuff we need to look at in order to make sure that we are able to give the Prime Minister a bunch of short and long-term recommendations for us to achieve the highest possible. At the moment, the aspiration is 8% sustainable growth. And for that, we need to look at both short-term factors and structural factors. And we've identified 10 areas in which we need to look closely to come up with to start coming up with these recommendations in a month's time.
Fair point indeed, and those 10 actionable points are in fact very, very important ones. They're on the screens for our viewers to watch. It's economic growth, employment, fiscal framework, informal sector, monetary policy, public expenditure, to name just a few. But Dr. Roy, I must ask you this question. While I know that was not the immediate point of discussion, but what is the view of the council, and particularly your view on the slowdown? Because there are two theories out there. One is that this slowdown was perhaps induced because of the anticipation and the early glitches of the GST and perhaps demonetization lingering on. And the second view is that this slowdown has been in the making for the last 6 quarters. Where do you stand on the slowdown per se?
I don't stand on the slowdown per se because one cannot. First, what we have had is quarterly growth figures which are lower than quarterly growth figures in the past. If you look at trend lines, then while I think the most serious question is those trend lines are not taking us at this time to a stable and structural long-term sustainable growth rate close to 8% or more. So I think the way to look at it is to say that, okay, we take this quarterly information into account as one of the factors that we need to consider in the domain areas that you have just outlined to see how we can look at short and medium-term measures that we could recommend to the Prime Minister to ensure that level of stable and structurally sustainable growth. The short term is of necessity now because there are things we could do in policy instruments coming up, such as the current budget, the forthcoming budget, and therefore we will look at different ways of expressing policy such that we achieve that goal. And then, of course, that has been nested in a bunch of long-term measures, which is part of the continuity of structural reforms that we have been attempting in India since 1991.
Fair point indeed, and I think that's a pragmatic approach to take, that you have a 8% sustainable growth in mind, and recommendations perhaps will center and figure around that, both long-term and short-term. But I do want to also ask you to perhaps clear the air on the stand that the council has on fiscal consolidation. I know fiscal framework is one of the agenda points. What is your personal stance on fiscal consolidation? Because there is such a clamor for fiscal stimulus, which will perhaps lead to some amount of fiscal expansion. Are you one of those people who believes fiscal consolidation at every cost is welcome?
I believe fiscal consolidation is necessary, and I believe that fiscal consolidation has happened very creditably over the past few years. I would like to see it maintained. Contrary to popular opinion, I'm not a doxological or theological fiscal hawk. I have yet to see any compelling reason why fiscal consolidation should either be paused or reduced in focus on the basis of what that incremental fiscal consolidation would bring in the short term to the economy. But I'm open to ideas, and that is why I welcome this discussion that's going to happen in the Council.
I'm glad you're saying you're open to ideas, and I think that's exactly what people would want to hear, the fact that the PMEAC members are not fiscal fundamentalists, quote unquote. But I will ask you this question. You were also a member of the NK Singh panel on fiscal consolidation, which does give the government an elbow room of about a 50 basis points fiscal slippage if there were to be structural reforms. Do you believe GST, or for that matter demonetization, perhaps pave the way for those kind of structural reforms, merit fiscal expansion?
Well, firstly, the FRBM committee recommendations have not been accepted or implemented yet. So the question is a hypothetical one. Until such recommendations are accepted and implemented. At the moment, the government is free within the framework of the current FRBM to decide whether it wants to stick to policy commitments it has made or not. And if not, then all I would urge is that the basis for that be made clear. And when I know the basis, I can take a view, a personal, professional view on whether I agree with that basis or not.
All right, that's perhaps a valid and a fair assessment of things. Not accepted, so no view there. But I will ask you one more question on FISC before I move any further, and this has to do with what we are picking up. I mean, the fact that there is a slowdown, and there has been a lot of commentary and opinion out there that believes that this kind of a slowdown perhaps needs a lifeline. It perhaps needs a stimulus from the government. What I'm going to ask you is that because this is widespread, and you admitted that this is nowhere close to where our growth should be, what should the nature of that helpline, lifeline, stimulus really be? Should this be sector specific? Should this be consumption oriented? Should this be investment oriented? I'm just trying to pick your brains on that.
I think that's an excellent question to ask the director of NIPFP. So if I may answer in that capacity.
Please go ahead.
Yes? All right.
Yes,
The
sure,
answer
please
is
go
actually
ahead.
the same as I said earlier, but I'll be more emphatic. I cannot see any circumstances under which a macro level fiscal stimulus can be used to stimulate growth in the next 2 quarters. That means, logically speaking, that the only way that a macro level fiscal stimulus would stimulate growth in the next 2 quarters would be by addressing an aggregate demand problem. If you look at the pattern of central government spending, and I'm assuming we're only talking about that and not state governments, then there is very little the government can do to boost consumption demand except by increasing its revenue deficit. And that raises a whole host of second order questions regarding the composition of government revenue expenditure. Raising public investment by deploying extra money, I'm not convinced that I see that the impact of that, given past records, given the quality of public investment creation at this time, unless there are parametric and structural changes, which will take longer. I cannot see that putting a dollar or a rupee extra into public investment, which is deficit financed, would result in an increase in aggregate demand in the time frame you're looking for, which is the next 2 quarters. I could be wrong. I may have not looked at something. I would welcome anyone who can give me a plausible argument for a specific deployment of extra borrowed funds into consumption or investment by government, by central government, that would result in a pickup in aggregate demand in the next 2 quarters.
Considering one of the action agendas is consumption that the council has decided for itself, how are we going to rev up consumption? Because consumption as an engine of growth is also extremely subdued. I mean, the only engine that's firing right now perhaps is public sector expenditure. And I'm going to ask you a question on that. But consumption as that engine of growth is not revving up as well.
You rev up consumption as an engine of growth by making sure that the people who want to consume more have the resources to consume more. Let me, in the short time available, say this, that if your leading indicator of the economy is not going to be things that people consume and therefore produce, such as what the mass of people in India consume are not four-wheelers and two-wheelers, which seems to be the very favorite leading indicator of Bombay. What the mass of people in India consume are food, clothing, housing, health, education. So in my view, we need to understand how we can stimulate in a sustainable way consumption in these areas. The only way you do it is by producing more of each of these, because we know that there isn't enough. We're importing food, we're importing clothing. We made a good beginning on low cost and affordable housing, but there isn't enough housing, and we really do need to fix the quality and affordability of health and education in this country, and affordability, access, etc. So I think that is more talking about a sort of shift in the priorities on how we secure 8% growth, in my personal view. That is how I view the consumption problem. As long as we focus as our leading indicator stuff that a bunch of the people who have actually benefited disproportionately from liberalization have, we are going to get the consumption answer wrong. And therefore, I think what I would advocate personally is a shift in emphasis. And I think there's a lot of room to get us onto a sustainable growth path by increasing the production of what the common person in India consumes. I've just given you the 5 things I think they do consume.
I do understand that. Yes, you're right in saying perhaps cars is not the common man consumes, and that's one of the indicators that some of us follow. But, you know, the council also spoke about the shape of economic tracker, and that's an interesting part that the council will be looking at. What sort of an economic tracker will this be? Could you share any details with us at this stage? Is this going to be a monthly economic tracker? What kind of indices will perhaps be tracked?
That is the kind of important and delightful conversation that we need to have with fellow professionals like you over the next month. In terms of the content of the tracker, I mean, we are not presumptuous enough as economists to believe that we know the answer to that question now. Obviously, we will track stuff like production, consumption, the balance of payments, macro indicators, and then there's a question of what other indicators we will track. But I think the idea of an economic tracker is that we have reasonably good real-time information on important things that the council needs to keep a watch on, so as to be able to give the Prime Minister our recommendations, if necessary, suo moto, on danger signals that we see. And one point I want to emphasize, if I may, Maithili, is we're not looking at this as an exercise in isolation. This is not going to be, like perhaps it was in the past, yet another alternative way of looking at the economy. So the idea is very much to work in synergy with the Ministry of Finance, the RBI, the professional economist community such as yourselves, to come up with a tracker that actually reflects the broader view on important things that are going on. And that is a combined effort. We look forward to sort of interacting, I think, with the professional economics community across the country, as well as with industry, agriculture, and other stakeholders, to design and develop this tracker in the years going ahead, which will be at the disposal of the entire machinery of government and other stakeholders involved in our common objective of getting to 8% growth.
Indeed. Maithili is going to be joining us. She was supposed to be a part of the show, but you wanted to do a one-on-one, so she'll join us a little later. I'm Supriya Srinath in the Delhi studios. But I will, sir, take a question on monetary policy, because I think that's also one of the actionable agendas that the council has outlined. What sort of consultation will really be? Because there is already an MPC, and many people are perhaps reading this as course collision. Will you clear the air on that?
The Monetary Policy Committee has a specific and important mandate, which is to decide whether to keep interest rates on hold or increase or decrease them, consistent with the maintenance of the inflation target. Obviously, monetary policy is more than what the Monetary Policy Committee does. Second, given that that is the remit of the Monetary Policy Committee, it is important for the professional economics community to look at what the Monetary Policy Committee does, what monetary policy does in consonance with other macro instruments such as exchange rate policy and fiscal policy, and take a sort of view on how it may be best harnessed to achieve our common objective of higher and sustainable growth. So it's an overlapping quest with that of the Monetary Policy Committee, but the focus of this quest is different. It is, of course, harmonious with what the Monetary Policy Committee needs to do, because one important area of sustainability is to make sure that inflation is kept within, the bounds that government commits to. But then we have different ways of achieving that, and we have different implications of such inflation for the real economy and for growth. And so what we want to do is explore what these are, understand these pathways better, and make recommendations then on how monetary policy and fiscal policy and exchange rate policies and other economic policy levers available to the whole of government can be used in optimally to secure sustainable and higher growth.
So what you're essentially saying is it doesn't have to be contrary, it will perhaps be complementary at best. But, sir, I can't not ask you the question on your stance on the RBI's monetary policy framework right now. The RBI has decided to pause, not given into the clamor for a rate cut. What's your view? Do you believe the central bank has missed the bus? And in some sense, this whole walk on the path of growth alone will be made by fiscal policy, at least as things stand?
It's a good question. I'll answer it in two parts. One, I'm not professionally inclined to confuse or how do I put it, instruct or take a view is perhaps best, on the job of the Monetary Policy Committee, which is to by quarter to take a decision at the margin consistent with its inflation target whether to raise interest rates or not. If you take a whole view, then your second part of question comes into place, which is how should fiscal, monetary and exchange rate policies and other policies be used in a complementary way to secure growth. And the answer there would be that it cannot be the case that we allow monetary dominance, which is one important instrument of government, which is monetary policy, be used exclusively and only to target a particular inflation indicator. I think there's room for a conversation on that while recognizing the primacy of monetary policy in doing so. And I think there's ample room for us to be able to dialogue to see how we could use both fiscal and monetary policies in consonance to secure that common goal. Now, that does not mean that I'm in favor of quarter by quarter assessments of whether we follow a neutral, expansionary or contractionary monetary policy. But I'm certainly in favor of saying that it's important to make sure that both the price of capital and its availability is a factor that is taken into account in context other than inflation, and to leave that to fiscal policy alone would not just be erroneous, it is not something that is in common practice in most emerging economies.
Okay, and I don't fault you for saying that at all because I think that's a very pragmatic approach to this whole monetary policy versus fiscal policy debate. A quick question on the GST, sir, and that has been brought in with much fanfare, and we at ET now believe that GST is what India definitely needs, the early glitches and the early troubles set aside. But are you, as an economist and as a member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, because I'm sure at one stage the Prime Minister will turn around to people like you and ask what has gone wrong? I mean, why is compliance and collection level with the GST so dismal? And that is worrying a lot of people, including stakeholders in the Indian economy. What would you attribute this to? And how best to make it a better GST?
Well, the Prime Minister has not asked me that question yet. And when he does, I will need some time to answer it. But I wouldn't agree with you that what has happened with the GST is that it's gone completely wrong, anything dramatic like that. The GST, as you say, is a good reform. I have said before in public, and I will say before again, that, but now it's a point of history, that we could have had a more efficient design. I am convinced that the intention is to move towards that more efficient design. And I think it is just too early to take a call on what is happening with GST. For instance, there was much talk about how GST, just a month ago, which I read in the press, of how GST would cause revenue shortfalls this fiscal. I now have information, credible information, showing that that was overblown. And that is very encouraging. So I think you will just have to give both me and the council more time to see how GST unfolds, to allow the administrators, because that's an administrative job, to get the machinery of GST right so as not to have unforced or avoidable errors, and to have a better GST administration. And then to see whether this quest we have there, I think, in common between the central and state governments to get a GST which is designed in a slightly more simple way is met. So I would continue to advocate, as I've been doing, for a simpler GST and for a GST that in its design incorporates simplicity, because that is the big gain we get from having a sort of nationwide tax, and that is where you will get a single market kicking in. I have seen nothing to make me feel that that is a quest that I need to give up on yet. So let us walk this journey together, and let us see how we can get these constructive, changes happening to the GST, bearing in mind political realities in a complex federal economy.
Okay, a quick question on jobs, sir, because I think that's the big focus area for the council and something that I think a lot of people will be looking at your recommendations and your thoughts on. We've got, what, 10 to 12 million people who are entering workforce annually, and we're at best creating just over a million jobs. And that is the big focus area for both the government and for people like yourselves who are going to contribute to this policy making. What are the avenues of job creation really? Because many people believe that India needs to create a new IT in some sense. Can healthcare be that? Can some other sector be that? Is really the big question.
It's a very good question. I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone does. I can tell you where my instinct lies, and which I will be putting forward as we go ahead. My instinct lies in an unease with the fact that when we measure the success of the Indian economy in generating growth, what we look at are four-wheeler sales and two-wheeler sales as leading indicators, because these are not the things that the majority of the Indian public consumes. Our problem with inclusive growth is not just that we're not generating enough jobs, but that people are not participating in the business process of delivering growth, however high. Now, the way you deliver it is, in my view, to produce the things that people consume. And what do the poorest in India consume? They consume food. We import that at the margin. They consume clothing. We import that at the margin. They consume housing. We have made a great start to affordable housing, but there's a long path to travel. And then, as you say, they consume health and education. So if you are able to produce more of these five things, which people lack, as we all know, there is no question that we lack health, we lack education, we lack affordable housing, then we know that there is demand for this. And if you're able to do this affordably and efficiently, you will get sustainable and inclusive growth. And all these areas are areas where, in my limited understanding of this, jobs are not areas that you would automatically think of as capital intensive. So I think there is a synergy there, a sweet spot there, which we could exploit. But of course, this is just me, and my ideation about where I think we need to pay more focus. We need to pay more focus on what the masses of India consume, which are also consumed by the non-masses. I eat food, so do you, clothing, etc. So if we can focus on these five things and improve both the efficiency of production in these five areas, their quality, and provide more consumption in these areas, then that would drive consumption-led growth, and that would also improve the productivity and inclusivity of our growth process.
On that note, Dr. Rathin Roy, thanks very much for joining us right here on ET Now. We wish you all the very best with recommendations that the Prime Minister will certainly heed to. You are part of the Economic Advisory Council that will be advising the Prime Minister on certain very crucial issues, and we wish you the very best with that. Thanks very much, sir, for being with us on ET Now.
Thank you very much.
I've got an expert panel joining us right here. We've got Dr. Arvind Virmani, President Chintan Live. We've got M. Govind Rao, former member of the PM EAC, Manish Sabharwal, Chairman of Team Lease Services Private Limited, and of course, Maithili Busnul Mata, consulting editor. Thanks each one of you for being with us. And Maithili, let me begin with you. On the question of slowdown, Rathin Roy was candid and he said we did not really discuss factors that have led to the slowdown. We did not really discuss the slowdown per se, but the whole idea of the Economic Advisory Council is to give recommendations that will steer India towards the 8% sustainable path of growth, long-term, medium-term, short-term. Your quick thoughts on that approach. Do you believe that's pragmatic? 8% is at best we can do sustainably. Let's not browbeat, let's not have chest thumping and talk about growth levels of 10%. 8%, but on a sustainable level.
Well, yes, 8% and at a sustainable level, I think, is the new normal. But the big question mark really is whether the PM EAC can add really to the debate, because there is no dearth of suggestions. We've had suggestions both from Niti Aayog, we've had suggestions from the Chief Economic Advisor, we've had suggestions within the Finance Ministry and from outside. So I'm not so sure what is it that the PM EAC can really add to it. If you compare with what the PM EAC was during the UPA days, there was a very close relationship between the chairman, Dr. Rangarajan, and Dr. Manmohan Singh. It went beyond just the professional relationship, and to that extent the Prime Minister had implicit faith in the advice that Dr. Rangarajan gave. Now, Dr. Bibek Debroy does have a close relationship with Narendra Modi, but it's nowhere near the kind of relationship that there was in the UPA days between Rangarajan and Manmohan Singh. So to that extent, I'm not very sure how this advice from the PMAC will really raise the level of debate and contribute meaningfully to raising India's rate of growth to that sustainable level, or whatever it is. 8% is good enough if we can do it. But I'm not so sure that the PMAC can contribute in a very concrete fashion to achieving that.
I will address the immediacy or the urgency of what the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council can and cannot do, but let's address the elephant in the room. And I changed the course of the discussion with Dr. Rathin Roy because I realized that fiscal framework is one of the big agendas on the council, and the council seems to be on the stance that the government should not really waver away from the path of fiscal consolidation, despite the fact that there's been such clamor from a fiscal stimulus point of view. Dr. Arvind Virmani, let me throw this to you. Are you surprised and are you in some sense concerned that people on the council, and we heard Professor Bibek Debroy talk earlier as well, do not want the government to waver away from the path of fiscal consolidation, which means no extra expenditure, even if that means to boost growth?
So two major points here. Firstly, I think everybody has forgotten there's already been a huge fiscal stimulus. It was done through oil taxes. So I'm surprised that people have forgotten so quickly after this huge discussion we had a couple of weeks ago. So in a way, fiscal stimulus is already in the pipeline. It's there. Second point which I made in my paper, which I did analyzing the growth slowdown and the effects of demonetization, etc., was that normally fiscal deficit is an outcome. What we have to focus on is the expenditures, the taxes, and the way we generate revenues, that is where the combination exists, which is the sale of public sector units or shares in public sector banks, etc. So what would not surprise me if they actually focus on that. If they don't focus, I would be very surprised, because given there's a fiscal expert, he should be telling the government more about what is the better way to spend money in the short term, not in 20 years time, not in 5 years time, but in the next year and a half leading up to the budget and perhaps in the budget. The second one, I just want to taxes. We've discussed a GST before, so I just want to mention it. One of the ways you can provide a stimulus is by simplifying the GST. That will by itself be complementary to private sector investment. That will be a stimulus. So I think that in my view, and as I made clear in the paper, this discussion of the stimulus per se rather than of what is the better way to spend money that government has, the taxes and raising capital. I mean, we've had a capital market boom for the last 6 years, yet there has been no increase in sale of public sector shares and units to the public. That would be a good subject for the Economic Advisory Council to take up.
Okay, fair point indeed. I think he was very categorical, and rightly so, when he said that he wonders what that extra fiscal space will be used for, and that is crucial. I grant him that. But Manish Sabharwal, before I go to Govind Rao, I want to ask you this question directly. When I asked him on fiscal stimulus, he said under no circumstances the macro level fiscal stimulus can address the next few quarters' growth. In essential terms, ruling out their support for a fiscal stimulus, which many otherwise believe the economy needs. I concede with what Dr. Virmani says. A simplified GST will perhaps be a fiscal stimulus, or the excise cut has been a partial fiscal stimulus. But I believe it's neither here nor there. The big fiscal stimulus that we've been speaking about, that the government has been indicating, the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council at this stage believes that from a macro level point of view, it doesn't really address the concerns. Will you agree? Manish Sabharwal.
I mean, I don't think India has a jobs problem. I think we have a wages problem. And I say that I'm happy to debate that with you, because I heard you say that, there are only 1 million jobs being created, but there are 12 million people joining the labor force. I mean, if you've decided that India's unemployment rate is a fudge, because our official unemployment rate is 4.9%. Now, if there are 11 million people being added to the labor force, the unemployment should be doubling every year, right? So I think it's important to sort of frame this problem, because if you think India's problem is jobs, then you'll throw money from helicopters and you'll do NREGS. If you think it's wages, and I think it's wages, I think everybody who wants a job has a job, they just don't have the wages they want. If you think the problem is wages, it's formalization, it's urbanization, it's industrialization, it's human capital. I don't think the weather of the moment has changed in the last 5 years. India's always been in a jobs crisis. I'm glad people have woken up to it. And I don't think there's anything that busting the fisc is not going to solve this problem. I mean, the biggest gift you can give to job creation is macroeconomic stability. India's track record with using fiscal stimulus to create jobs is pathetic. I mean, it doesn't exist. Forget about it's pathetic. So I'm very clear that busting the fisc for creating jobs, whoever's asking for it, is obviously not in touch with the job market, because we don't have a jobs problem, we have a wages problem, which means we have to expand the formal sector, we have to improve productivity, and you can't do that in the next 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months.
Fair point indeed. I'm going to touch upon jobs in more details, because the data that I have on me is a little baffling. The textile sector or the IT sector, or that banks are employing. I'll come back to you, and I think I'm going to pick your brains on that. But let me just address the elephant in the room, like I began by saying, which is fiscal deficit versus fiscal stimulus that's required. And Govind Rao, I'm going to ask you. Rathin Roy said he is no fiscal fundamentalist. He isn't a fiscal hawk, but he would want to see what this extra money is going to be spent for and spent on. He also said, why should consumption only be looked at through the basket of, two-wheelers and car sales and all of that? It has to be food and clothing and affordable housing and things like that. But of course, he doesn't quite agree with this whole approach to fiscal stimulus. We've had a chat before on this. What's your view? Do you agree with the stance that the Economic Advisory Council is taking at this stage, which is that the government, under every circumstance, should stick to the path of fiscal consolidation? Govind Rao?
I think Economic Advisory Council has very competent people. I think this call that we should stick to the fiscal consolidation path is very appropriate at this juncture, particularly when there is so much of a noise that we should create a stimulus, etc. It's it's important to stick to the path, because as it is, you have a very high fiscal deficit today. You know, the union and states taken together, the budgeted deficit is about 6% of GDP. On top of it, the loan waivers and the possibility of pay commission recommendation at the state level or pay revision at the state level, and you know, and then the additional interest payment on account of Uday is going to be another 0.6 to 0.7%. This is not factored in the budget estimates. On top of it, it is not going to be easy for the central government to stick to the fiscal deficit target of 3.2% this year. There is a lot of shortfall in disinvestment, the dividends from the Reserve Bank of India, and mind you, your household sector financial savings for 2016-17 is just about 8.1%. That is the amount, the money available for, you know, lending. Out of the 8.1%,
Okay.
if you take away 6.5% on account of fiscal deficit of the center, you know, where is the money that is available? And then another 1.5% will go to the public enterprises. Where is the money available for the private sector to lend? Where is the borrowing space for the private sector? The entire argument for fiscal deficit target was on the basis of household sector financial savings and the current account deficit that you have, that means foreign savings that come to you. Now,
Right,
you don't
right.
really have the space, and at this juncture,
made your
if
point,
you say
yes.
that, no, that is one part of it. The second
Right.
part of it is, the moment you say that we will relax the fiscal deficit target, that becomes a norm. And then, as it is, we should have achieved the target
Okay.
in 2008,
So-
9, and then now we are almost 10 years behind. And still, we still want to
I
say
understand.
that
So
we
it's
want
not
to
just the
relax
Prime Minister's
because
Economic
that is an
Advisory
easy-
Council, but members on my panel also believe that fiscal deficit target should not be expanded. I get your point there, sir. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute on the other issues. And let's address the other big thing that I think is a huge headline from the Economic Advisory Council. Maitli, come in on that. The MPC is already in place, and yet the Economic Advisory Council, one of the agendas is monetary policy framework. You know, I asked him, is this course collision? And he said, at best, it's going to be complementary. Why should you think this is going to be contrarian? Are you as hopeful?
Well, I'm not very happy about that at all, because the entire idea of setting up a monetary policy committee was to give them autonomy. And the moment you have some other entity, whether it is a PMAAC or the Chief Economic Advisor or anybody else, also taking a view on monetary policy, then it in many ways undermines both the authority as well as the autonomy of the MPC. The entire purpose of shifting to a new monetary policy framework was precisely to distance monetary policy formulation from any kind of political influence. Remember, earlier the governor was the main deciding authority, so it was felt that the governor could be arm twisted, could kind of be persuaded, cajoled, whatever. So the whole idea of setting up an MPC was precisely to ensure that that arm's length distance remains, and it is there in fact. So the moment you have the PMAAC also looking at monetary policy, I don't know what purpose it serves. I think in many ways it undermines the authority, and even if it does not actually undermine, the perception is very important. Remember, in a democracy, a political democracy, perceptions are as important as reality. So I think this is a very retrograde step. The PMAAC should steer very clear of in any kind of interference in monetary policy formulation.
Arvind Virmani, I'm going to ask you a direct question and quote Rathin Roy on this. He said, we must not allow monetary dominance to just target inflation, and the price of capital and its availability for investments must also be taken into account. Essentially not, and this was in response to a direct question that I asked him, is RBI not relenting on rates a thing of concern? How are you going to respond to this? Because Maitli believes she's not happy with this, and this perception-wise believes that there is some kind of an interference. I have read out the exact quote to you. Monetary dominance to just target inflation must not be allowed for. Dr. Virmani.
Well, as far as you know, there's a constitutional, like it's a valid point that MPC is created by a law which lays out what its objectives are. I think if there is a need to change those objectives, it should be done by changing the law. So I agree with Maitri to that extent, that you know, the objectives are laid out. It's not something which has come out of the air. It's in the law. And if we think that law now needs to change, we should change the law. we should not try to undermine the law by sniping at it. That's one point. The second point is that that there is a difference between technical analysis of inflation, the effect of monetary policy on inflation, the effect of monetary policy on other things. I think it's perfectly legitimate for any professional, whether it's me or whether it's a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee, to do technical work on this, have it kind of processed or examined, critiqued by the PMEC, and put that out. I think if the MPC is really professional, if the RBI claims to be very professional, they also have to be open to technical criticism and take account of it. If they think that technical analysis of some things, like for example, which I and Bhalla have been saying for 18 months, that there's continuously over predicted inflation, is that correct or not? Is that right? Is that wrong? If you are a professional body, you should be open to that criticism. If you are wrong, you tell us that you guys are talking through your hat. Technically, you're not right. This is the basis on which we make predictions. What is the basis on which you or anybody else is saying that we perform better or worse than you? So I don't agree with Maithili on that point. I think a professional independent regulator then also has to be open to technical and professional criticism.
Okay. So Maithili believes this is an interference. You believe this is going to be, they should be open to some kind of evaluation. But I'm going to rest the debate there on monetary policy. But Govind Rao, if I may come to you on public expenditure, because that's also one of the areas of focus. And both you and I know that public expenditure is perhaps the only engine of India's growth that's revving right now. The objective of public sector expenditure was very clearly to let the growth engines up and then to crowd in the private sector investment. Given that this is one of the agenda points of the council, how are they going to ensure that this is done? Because there are limitations to public sector expenditure as well, and its obvious repercussions.
Well, I mean, from what I heard from Rathin in conversation with you, they're not going to expand the scope of public expenditure. So if they are not going to, or possibly they are going to look at the value for money, basically look at the productivity aspects. In this context, if you really want a crowding in, they should basically sequence the various long-standing unfinished projects, both in the in public sector as well as in the private-public partnership areas, and then to prioritize them and release resources for completing in a prioritized manner. So that you see those are so the benefits of those are available to the society, and then obviously there is a need for reducing the expenditures on subsidies and transfers, both subsidies and transfers, as they say, it's not just the subsidies. And then obviously there is it is you need to increase capital expenditure on many items. When I say again at the state level, obviously you can't PMEAC cannot recommend things to the state, but then they can certainly make analysis and then show there is a need for so both enhancing the total expenditures and increasing so productivity of expenditures on education and healthcare, and these are some of the things that possibly they will look at. So they will have to look at the composition of expenditure, productivity of expenditure, and prioritize expenditures in areas where they can you can get the results quickly, and so that there is productivity of overall public expenditures increases.
Okay, fair point indeed. I'm going to take this across to Manish Sabharwal, and Manish, you started off by saying that there isn't a dearth of jobs. Where there is a lacuna is wages. I could be wrong and I could be entirely right, but if I were to just point out certain statistics that we've done internally here at ET, now you look at the textile sector, 67 units have shut down in the last 1 year. HDFC Bank, for instance, we've tracked some of the listed entities. The workforce is down by nearly 7,000 people. The big IT workforce and hiring have both slowed down. Are you still going to say this is just a case of wages, and which then brings us to the point of gainful employment? Or is there also an issue of jobs? And then what should the scope of the Economic Advisory Council's approach to jobs be? Should they be looking at job creation, or should they actually be looking at more gainful employment? Because these are two distinctly different things.
Well, I mean, IT is 0.7% of India's labor force. It's wonderful. We love it. It's great for India's brand, but it's a rounding error from a labor market perspective. And 8,000 jobs from financial services would be made up by one payment services company. So on a net basis, financial services is not losing jobs because fintech is hiring and banks are losing. So, be careful with anecdotal evidence, and frankly, be very careful with any labor market data, because officially 27% of Indians say they work for an enterprise with more than 9 employees. And officially 1.5%, only 1.5% of enterprises say they have more than 9 employees. So labor market data is really all over the place, and it's important to recognize that you can't reconcile what households are saying with what enterprises are saying, and that's a bigger problem which is some people are working on. So anecdotal evidence of IT has gone down. Well, IT is 0.7% of India's labor force. So yes, I do believe that our unemployment rate is not a fudge. It's 4.9%, but that's not something to be proud of, because a large part of our labor force is working poor. So 70% of the kids coming to our job fairs, and we do hundreds of them, are saying, 5,000 ki naukri to lule langde ko mil jayegi. I've already got a job at 5,000. I'm here for a job of 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 rupees a month. So I think India is wonderfully redefining its expectation from a job to minimum wage to a living wage. But those are two different problems, because if you think the problem is jobs, so what does the Economic Advisory Council do? I think it focuses on formalization, urbanization, industrialization, and human capital. I mean, in a government who has had above average performance in many ministries like infrastructure and coal and power, I think Ministry of Labor and Ministry of HRD need to get its act together, because human capital is an important part of better wages and jobs. So, and be careful with sort of saying exactly which sector will grow jobs, because the role of the government is not to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. We always are breathless. Oh, the Indian economy is in the emergency room. Don't talk about long-term stuff. Just do a triage like a doctor does in the emergency room. If the patient's in the emergency room every day, every year, you need to talk about losing weight. You need to talk about health. So I would be careful in extrapolating the weather of the moment in the last 2-3 months or 2-3 weeks, about jobs being sort of overboard and getting killed, because jobs have been a problem for 20 years, and they will be for another 5.
I'm going to round this up, and I'll give each one of you under a minute to just make closing remarks. And Manish Sabharwal, I'm going to begin with you, and we'll hold you on to what you just said. You're perhaps right that, I think the whole idea of a job fair is being exaggerated, but what would your recommendation to this council be as they approach the subject? Yes, human capital and the labor ministry needs to get its act together and all of that, but, your precise, give me 2 points that you would want this council to do to look at the job market.
I mean, you would focus on labor reform. You would focus on stuff like Provident Fund and ESI and 45% payroll confiscation in India, between 45% and between gross wages and net wages. I think that's the lowest hanging fruit in labor reform. Everybody equates labor reform with Chapter 5B of the Industrial Dispute Act, which is hire and fire. But there are thousands of things to be done which are in the nature of plumbing, which will make a difference to formal job creation. Again, regulatory cholesterol is not holding back job creation. It is holding back formal job creation. So there are many things in labor laws, and there are many things in overall regulatory cholesterol which can be done. Labor laws, the lowest hanging fruit is Provident Fund and ESI reform, which was announced in the budget 2 years ago and has still not happened. So that, to my mind, would make a huge difference to formal job creation, because every time I give a kid a salary in a job fair, he says, "Haath wali salary or chitti wali salary?" Because of the 45% payroll wedge, which is the highest in the world, by the way, in India. So I would say Provident Fund ESI reform would have a huge impact right now on formal job creation.
Okay, in under 1 minute, Maithili, I'm going to turn to you. And the idea that one gets from the Economic Advisory Council really is that they're going to work towards the budget and inputs will be taken in the budget. There is this does a sense of urgency and immediacy lack for you as far as this council is concerned, or do you believe that's how they've been set up? They're going to come out with recommendations, let the Prime Minister mull over them. Some of them will make its way to the budget, because one thought that the crisis is then and now, and you know it looks like we're not talking in terms of immediacy and urgency right then. Maithili.
Yeah, what I agree with Govind over here, Supriya, because the PMAC is essentially a recommendatory body, and while it's always welcome to have expert advice, frankly in this country there is no dearth of expert advice. We've had lots of blueprints, lots of committee reports, whether it's on taxation, whether it's on anything under the sun, there's no dearth of blueprints. The question is whether the government of the day can do it, and this is where political economy considerations come in, which is why I'm happy to see the PMAC talk about implementable recommendations. Now the question is, what is implementable to a non-elected committee cannot be the same as what is implementable for a government which has to face the electorate. So the EAC members don't have to stand for election, the government of the day has to. So that makes a big change in what the government can and cannot do. But to the extent that the PMEAC is cognizant of the fact that they must talk about implementable recommendations, I am glad they've had the maturity to think one is textbook recommendations and the other is what can be done. And what we need to do is what can be done, not in the immediate future, but certainly over the medium to longer term.
All right, no utopian recommendations because they will perhaps never make its way to the political economy. Dr. Arvind Virmani, will let you have the last word on this, and this is more from, you know, what Dr. Govind Rao and Maithili and everybody is saying, that this is one more recommendatory body, but the fact is that this recommendatory body is only for the sole consumption of the Prime Minister, and so in that sense, do you believe they yield more influence? And the second part of this is, it has come into effect after 3 years of this government being in office, in fact over 3.5 years of this government being in office, close to elections. What purpose will they eventually serve? Let you have the last word on this show then, Dr. Virmani.
So three things. One is that it can bring to the attention of the Prime Minister hard evidence, etc. You know, whether you take the recommendation, which quite right, I agree with Manish, made, or external sector reform, which I have been talking about, which has not happened for 10 years, or anything else. I don't think there is anybody in the government right now who is bringing solid evidence for the effects of policy change on various aspects of the economy. So that is one thing that it can certainly do. The second aspect, which I think is less likely, which was more in the previous one, was that if Prime Minister is not getting from other organs of the government certain specific things which he would like to have, those are the things that I think this body can and will focus on. You are quite right. I think there is no point in doing exactly duplicating what the Niti Aayog is supposed to do. Now perhaps under the old chairman it was interested in certain things and focused more on those. In the new one they may focus on others. But I don't think there is a point in duplicating that. I think basically what you also kind of implicitly concluded. So what is the policy which I think nobody has focused on? One, I mentioned external sector reform. The other one, agriculture, was supposed to be Niti. I don't know where it is gone. And the third is this whole labor, land and skills. Skills I would add, you know, yes, sorry, I wanted to add that as a third thing, which has not been mentioned. You know, given that 90% is informal sector and much of that is services, I still think this government and its advisors have not understood that you have to provide skills to this 90% of the population, not just for manufacturing, not just organized manufacturing. Those guys are much better prepared to do their own skilling. But what about this informal sector? And again, Manish got that right. It's all about productivity. Higher wages is about productivity, and productivity will come through skills. And I think we still haven't got that right.
All right. On that note, Dr. Arvind Virmani, Manish Sabharwal, Mr. M. Govind Rao and Maithili Busrunwat, thanks very, very much for being with us on the special edition of the India Development Debate. It's quite clear the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister has a task cut out. It should and must not be just another recommendatory body. It's got extreme influence on the Prime Minister and the advice that he's seeking or will seek in the future, and which is why recommendations perhaps need to be more pragmatic. They cannot be utopian. It has to be implementable, but with an idea to promote and fuel economic growth. Thanks very much, each one of you, for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.